What timing indeed. Welcome to episode 8 of Behind the Screens. My occasional look at the underpinnings of RPGs and the history of the good and the better. Um, in case you've blundered here by accident, which might apply, you never know. Sorry about that. Welcome to the Boys from the Baltic Star. My name's Ben, sometimes known as Bucky, and sometimes by less kindly names. And I'm here to bring you the benefit of my wealth of experience in things that happened before many of the current generation of role players were born. Because, that's what I do. We are a tabletop RPG channel, and we play our ongoing campaign of Traveller, a science fiction RPG, every Friday evening at 11 UK time. We also try to do plenty of other things as well. Most notably on Saturday nights at 11 UK time, we do a variety of things RPG related. Sometimes one shots, sometimes chats, whatever springs to mind. On Thursdays, it's sometimes the case that this behind the screens thing happens, and other times Luke, one of the crew, plays video games. And currently his Thursday night game is Hitman 2. He also plays games most Sunday evenings at 11:45 UK time, currently the narrative horror game Man of Medan. A theme has developed with the Sunday games. They've turned out to be more scary than the Thursday games, so Luke has taken to calling them Spooky Sundays. Because, it's alliterative. You can stay current with everything by following us on Twitter at BoysBaltic, and please accept my heartfelt thanks for watching, whether live or VOD. I hope you enjoy the experience, and if so, tell your friends, you know what I mean. If you don't, then of course I'm sorry about that, but more importantly, lie to your friends and tell them it was brilliant. This time, we're doing part 5 of RPG Adventures from Scratch. It's going to be quite a big one this time, because we're actually going to go through the main mission of what, for our purposes, is Chapter 2 of the proper plot. We're going to explain exactly how to build it up so the players have options, have freedom, and yet, as it turns out, also end up staying on the right track, at least roughly. Then, as we go, while it's fresh in our minds, rather than drop a cliffhanger, because I'd never do that, never, I'm going to show you how I would write that entire section up for a referee to use. Everything we've done so far in terms of structure and narrative and cheats and shortcuts will be on display, so hopefully you'll be able to see how all the moving parts come together. We're going to try. Anyway, then I'm going to reward you for your patience by telling you a little of the history of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, a story that includes brief moments of me being sarcastic, because I have to play to my strengths. We're going to take a look at a series of classic modules and maybe even encourage people to take another look at them, whether you play D&D or not, because they're a bit special. Then finally, I'm going to briefly chat about the way I approached writing the content for tomorrow night's Traveller session, which is our season opener for Season 2. It might be of interest to people who run their own campaigns, and I promise it will be mercifully brief and contain no spoilers. It does contain opportunities for me to be not at all sarcastic, but heartfelt and genuine instead. I mention that because I haven't exercised the muscles that are used for being not sarcastic very much, so you might hear the occasional creak or groan over the mic as they loosen up. So, with that all said, welcome to Behind the Screens. So, back to our cyberpunkish story. Last time, we got our party of courageous adventurers through the first gate of the adventure, essentially a funnel that leads them to their next piece of the mission. They're now independent of guidance, moving freely through the world once again, and as a GM, this poses a few questions for you. One thing that will have a massive effect on the way the game plays is something I always imagine as the length of the leash. Last time I talked a little bit about railroading. why it's essential that it happens, but also why it's great if it happens unnoticed. So when writing the adventure, you need to give this some thought. Generally, there should be more than one route to advance to achieve anything in the story, at least until you reach the gate into the next part. That matters because at the gate, the players know exactly what they have to do, why they have to do it, what happens if they fail, and so on. At that point, if the players decide to go off and do something else, well, they get to fail the mission. That's what they get to do. Most of the time, however, they're exploring the world in whatever way, whatever order, and whatever level of enthusiasm they want. So in those parts, there have to be multiple ways to get there, but not, absolutely not, an infinite number of ways. There have to be 3 ways. Okay, that's a bit of an oversimplification, apologies, but 3 is the ideal. There should be a straightforward, easy as pie, can't really go wrong, entry-level route that gets them to the next part of the adventure. There should be a more intricate, complicated, possibly faster route that offers additional rewards but requires both intelligence on the part of the players and some skills or successes on the part of the characters. And, this is critical, must have no negative consequences if failed. If they fail, they can still go through the basic route. You can't reward failure, but you can make sure that good ideas are at least unpunished. Then, there should be a really tough option. This one requires smarts from the players, good rolls from the characters, and can reward them with some exceptional information or bonus. However, this route comes with a negative consequence if they fail it, and they know this because you've told them in some way. So remember our story so far, with 3 possible avenues of progression. Good wine today. We want to track Ramirez, currently our only suspect, and we've reached the point where there are 3 ways to do this, by an amazing coincidence. 1. They go to her flat and try to find her or stake her out. Fairly easy. Doing it well will require physical skills such as stealth or disguise. 2. They stalk her electronically, trying to track her devices and find her that way. Harder, but a good skill check should get it done. The likely skills include electronics and computing, but if the equipment is provided by Intron, there's every chance that some help will be provided to lower the difficulty, perhaps. 3. They try to hack her online presence. To get calendars, schedules, mails, and other things that might enable them to find out where she's going, who she's meeting, and where she can be intercepted. Harder still, but it gets them ahead of her at least somewhat. This time, Intron can't help, and the skill checks will be fairly tough. They do have an edge, though. They might try to use the password, Lullaby, which shouldn't get them everything, but might make things a bit easier. If you want to know why Lullaby, it's in a previous edition of this one. This, though, will require that they both identify that password and think of a good way to use it. Essentially, it's clever role-playing, trying to get easier dice rolls. Always a good choice. So all of that now leads us to be able to write the instructions for this whole section of the adventure in a way that it would appear in an adventure module. For our purposes, I'm not going to describe the stat blocks for Ramirez or Smitty. Yes, there's a Smitty. Nor the actual skill checks needed because I have no idea what your game system is. I'm also just going to put in a basic placeholder for the description of the flat, for example. Again, what we're doing here is exploring the right way to structure an adventure, not how to map it. On the other hand, I am going to identify a few things to have available for the players in advance. I didn't go through all of this for the first part of the adventure, and I'm not planning to either. Nor am I planning to do this kind of detail ever again for later parts. But it feels like this section is fairly typical of how portions of missions are generally built, so it's the ideal example for showing you the finished content. Think of it as a template, I hope. In that spirit, imagine that this section appears a couple of pages into the adventure module after the introductory section and the events at the Intron offices. So, option 1, go to her flat, wait for her to come back, or even break in and wait for her. Either way, this is pretty easy. If they follow her, they'll be able to find the next meeting point, and that will advance the plot. If they capture her, they'll be able to question her to find out that information. It's relatively simple to do. So before we look at the next bit, let's find out what information Ramirez will provide. For the GM, the following information is critical. So when we write the module, this next section will be the GM's background to the Ramirez mission. Ramirez has only ever worked for Intron, and she's a fairly unhappy employee. The main source of her unhappiness turns out to be money, or lack thereof. She's developed a bit of a gambling habit, it seems, and some of her creditors have begun to make themselves more vocal on the subject of her lax approach to the mandatory repayment plan. Someone, at this point unknown except by the nickname Smitty, has purchased her outstanding debt and offered to tear up the IOU in exchange for a little assistance in the matter of gaining entrance to Intron. Smitty has told Ramirez that he works for a person interested in some of the high-value laboratory equipment that Intron has in its basement, because they work in a related field, providing recreational chemical substances to the population of the city. At the time, Ramirez agreed, she believed the raid was intended to steal some equipment that might be of use to the kind of laboratory that mass produces chemicals, and ideally wants to avoid a paper trail indicating the purchase of such equipment. The Intron equipment is insured, replaceable, and ultimately would prove a mere blip on their corporate expense account. In exchange, Ramirez would have her debt written off and would be able to remain in the serene state of having not been beaten to death with a cricket bat. It's a good deal for everyone, right? It appears, however, in hindsight, that the motive for the raid might have been different from the one Ramirez was encouraged to believe. In fact, a potentially deadly weapon was taken from the laboratory, and though the details have not been made public, Intron's internal security has been asking questions. Moreover, several Intron employees were asked to make an accounting of everything stolen or damaged in the lab, so Intron could understand what happened. Inevitably, this information is now circulating among Intron employees, and Ramirez has begun to realise she's deeply embedded in an ingot of pure oh-shititude. So that's the end of the GM's background part. But we haven't yet described the events that will happen in parallel with the actions of the players. So when we write her story, we have to decide what she, Ramirez, does next. This part is the GM's timeline, or at least a portion of it. So all the time the players are in this chapter, the NPCs have motivations to act and then actions to take. As this next part of the module is the timeline as presented to the GM. Behind the scenes, still, Ramirez has decided she needs to get out of town, but she's worried that doing so might make her look appropriately guilty. She doesn't know she's already the only suspect. Her idea is that she should disappear, and evidence lead people to believe that her disappearance is unrelated to the Intron break-in. She needs to fake her death, or something similar. This isn't something she knows how to do, and in this cyberpunkish world, she has no untraceable money or credentials that can be used to begin life anew. But she does know a criminal, Smitty. She's contacted Smitty to arrange a meeting at a local bar, and Smitty has agreed to the meeting. You might wonder why Smitty would agree to such a thing, but he also has a plan. Okay, that section we've just done is actually the first part of the timeline, the part that's essentially automatic. That's already happening whatever the players do. But we also need to impact the timeline based on the decisions of the players. This becomes a series of narrative if-then statements, as in, if the players do this, then the events change thusly. How often do I get to use the word thusly? Brilliant. Right, so if the party uses option 1, follow Ramirez, they can either stake out her flat and follow her to the meeting with Smitty, or they can break in, find the evidence of the gambling, identify the reason for her involvement, and then follow or capture her. Even if she's killed in this exchange, they'll find a note on her person with the details of the meeting. Route 1 is therefore easy, complete, and gets them to the next part of the story, the bar, and Smitty. So how do we write that for the GM? We write a description of the flat and a list of the useful things that can be found there for the GM. So here goes. Ramirez lives in a small flat in a moderately nice area, its location seemingly valuable enough to be worth living in a modest space. It's well equipped but untidy. A good investigation check might reveal this is a relatively new development. In the last few weeks, Ramirez has let her environment deteriorate somewhat. On a table in one corner is a handwritten note. It names Ramirez and says, "Amount owed, 19,420. We will not accept any more bets until this debt is cleared." If the closet is searched, then a good investigation check might find another note in a coat pocket. It says, 8,311 to be paid by the 11th. That's all the information that can be found if the players visit the flat before Ramirez arrives. All the information, but not necessarily all the things. This could be an opportunity to describe some other things that are not relevant to the plot. Just remember that doing so might lead the players on a wild diversion, and if so, you need to have something prepared. If I'm writing the module for someone else, I make note of this as an opportunity for additional material, but I do not include any. This is where the GM will decide to offer a detour or some more context, if it's appropriate, and it should be relevant to their ongoing campaign, not to this one insular module. It's not for me to decide what's going to fit here. One thing I might include here, if I'm preparing it with all the bells and whistles attached, is a printable copy of each of the notes that the GM could hand physically to the players, or display as a graphic on screen at the right moment. We then need the way to get to Smitty if this is the approach the players have chosen. Smitty is not revealed in the flat unless Ramirez has already visited. So here's the if-then part of the path they've chosen as it is made available to the GM. If they follow Ramirez, an easy stealth check, she'll lead them to the meeting with Smitty after a very quick, hurried visit to the flat. If they lose her, they'll be able to find at the flat that she dropped a note in her haste. It reads, "Smitty, Green Door Lounge." If Ramirez realises she's being followed, an opposed stealth check, she will contact Smitty to warn him. If they capture Ramirez, they can find the note on her person, assuming they do so before she drops it, or they can interrogate her. She's terrified and easily intimidated. If they kill her, then the note will still lead them to the lounge. With that done, remember that they'll get to the lounge after Ramirez. But what of option 2? This is tracking her electronic devices and getting superficial access to them, with the help of Intron, who provided her with those devices as part of her employment. We've established it's a bit harder, but there's a reward inherent in it. They'll piece together her gambling problem and its consequences very quickly from her past messages, ones where she wasn't too concerned about security. They'll also be able to follow her electronically to the meeting with Smitty, something that allows them to get there without her having any chance to spot them, lose them, or deceive them. Moreover, Should they fail, they'll know that in advance and be able to resort to Route 1. So the GM's description is something like this. If the party succeeds in hacking the phone, an average hacking check or an easy one if they try variations on the password lullaby, they will be able to remotely monitor its exact location. Ramirez begins in a suburb, where she's just driving around waiting for a message. She'll return to her flat hurriedly, as we know, then set off for the Green Door Lounge. The party can follow her without risk of being spotted if they do so electronically. If they fail the hack, they will not reveal to Ramirez that they are trying to hack her. Again, in this situation, I would let the GM know there's room for additional information to be captured from the phone to advance the campaign or mislead the players. However, the actual plot content is something like this, her messages from oldest to newest. Message from Carson Dell. You now owe us $17,845. We've been made aware that we're not your only debt, but we'd better be the first you pay. This week. Message from Smitty. As agreed, I'm now the owner of all of your outstanding debts, and I'm prepared to write them off as soon as you come through with your part of the deal. Again, I might supply these in a suitably formatted graphic to add some scenery to the game, if I was feeling enthusiastic. Okay, but what of option 3? Well, in this case, they've taken a risk. If successful, they've captured the entirety of her communications, past and present. They even have the messages that were recently exchanged setting up the meeting at the bar. This way they can be at the bar before her and hopefully identify Smitty, stake the place out and prepare to follow him should that be their preferred route. But the risk has consequences. If they fail, they will alert Ramirez to their attempt. So 2 things. What happens if Ramirez knows she's being tracked? And how do we make sure the players know that by trying this they're taking the risk? Risks are only fair if the players can appropriately assess them. And while their characters might include expert hackers who can understand the danger, the players at the table are assessing risk based on the information given to them by the GM. So this, insider trick, is the right time for a risk roll. If the players decide to press ahead, make them roll a die based on their hacking skills, or their investigative skills, or their philosophy skills, if you can justify that, something they happen to have a fighting chance at. Don't give it to them for free, but make the roll reasonably easy. Unless they do unusually badly, they'll now be told what the risk is. They'll be told something's hard. They'll be told they might reveal information. Better still, when you make them do the roll, tell them it's a roll for risk assessment. That means, even if they fail it, they'll know there's an unquantified risk somewhere that they should consider. This is not a fake roll. It's not a dummy roll. It has actual consequences, but it's something they can use to help them assess the situation. Informed players are better for a number of reasons, but here's the biggie. If players feel they're thrashing around in desperate need of a plan, they'll come up with one that isn't in the list of options you prepared. And this is not ideal, because it makes the GM have to work much harder and much more on the fly. In my own experience, I get this part right maybe 4/5 of the time. Actually, I suspect a bit higher than that, but my players sometimes choose to go off the script anyway just because it's more fun for them at that moment. And this is fine, good even, as long as they know there are paths they can follow and can see a way getting back on them if their blue sky idea doesn't pan out. They'll be comfortable messing with you, as they should. And this is what I mean about the length of the leash. You can let them have a fair amount of length to play with, as long as you keep them in roughly the right place in the story. You can even let them off the leash completely. Just make sure that before you do, they know where to find the trailing edge of the leash, so they can return and clip it back on their collar when they're ready to proceed with the narrative. So obvious examples. include the way players sometimes feel they need to go shopping before a mission, or they want to make contact with a former ally from a previous adventure to get some advice or guidance. This is fine, of course, and as a GM you've clearly got a few simple encounter locations and NPCs in your back pocket for just such eventualities. Haven't you? Yes, you have. So, before we write up this section of the adventure as a finished piece of work, we need to identify a few more things. What happens if Ramirez becomes aware she's being followed, tracked or hacked, and what does Smitty do with that information? We also need to know why Smitty has agreed to meet with someone who might be a fugitive in the first place. So, if Ramirez learns she's being followed, something likely to happen if either option 1 was chosen and her awareness checks outmatch the party's stealth, something similar like that in whatever system you're using. She might also find this out if the party used option 3 and failed the discrete hack of the electronics. In either case, Ramirez will still attempt to make the meeting, but she might take a much more elaborate route to it and contact Smitty to warn him. Smitty will then decide to be absent from the meeting, but in his haste, he'll make a mistake, something that will allow the party to find his trail again in the future. If, however, Ramirez makes the meeting unaware, Smitty will confirm that she's returned to her flat and removed anything that might implicate him, then tell her he has a vehicle nearby and he'll smuggle her from the city. He does not, in fact, intend to do that. Instead, he's going to kill her and dump the body somewhere private. Smitty, turns out, not the greatest guy. Smitty's mistake, if he's been warned by Ramirez, he's still planning to kill her, but now he doesn't want to be present, so he'll call a couple of independent waste management contractors of his acquaintance to make sure they're present for her arrival. These two individuals are not especially skilled, and their presence will leave any number of possible avenues for finding Smitty. So all of that, in a rather wordy and indirect way, sorry about that, it's just how I am, leads us to option 3, the full hack. Now, if successful, the additional messages that can be acquired in the hack are: message to Smitty: I need to meet with you at once. Intron is asking questions, and it's in your interest to help me get out of town. Message from Smitty: meet me at the Green Door Lounge. Make sure there's nothing that can identify me at your flat before coming. If they get this information by hacking, they can get to the lounge before both Ramirez and Smitty. They will also not be spotted by Ramirez. So now the if-then block for option 3. If the party attempts a complete invasive hack, they must first make a roll, easy hacking or electronics or similar, to see if they recognise the risk inherent in such an attempt. If they succeed, they'll be aware they might reveal their attempt if the hack fails. If the party manages the hack, a very difficult hacking check, or just difficult if they use variations on the password lullaby, remember, they know where the meeting is and can get there before either Ramirez or Smitty. They also have all the details of the arrangement. If they fail, then Ramirez will know they've been snooping and will warn Smitty. So, at this point, we actually have an effective end to the chapter, because whether Smitty or a couple of thugs are at the lounge, whether Ramirez is going to the meeting, or under arrest, or dead, the party can be going to the lounge. The party is, in fact, moving to the lounge. You'll be delighted to hear that this is the only part of the process I'm going to cover in this sort of detail. And because I'm stopping here, it's only the first part of the chapter really, the Ramirez part, not the Smitty part. But if we went into that detail for that part as well, we'd be talking about this one chapter for twice as long. So I hope it was worth going over this bit so very thoroughly, just so you can see how the adventure would be written in its finished form. Next time, we'll go back to doing structure. So things will move much more quickly, I promise. Oh, yeah, and one other thing. Action.